Buenas tardes, muchas gracias por su atención en una tarde especialmente particular en la que lo más elemental parece habernos fallado. Pero en fin, es política de la Fundación, de que nada podrá con nosotros, y gracias a la colaboración del profesor Eugene Rogan, pues vamos a tirar adelante con esta conferencia que todos esperábamos con grandísima ilusión y que por mucha luz que falte y mucha electricidad que falte, no va a dejar de tener lugar. Se podrán preguntar ustedes por qué hacemos una conferencia sobre la relevancia de los sucesos de Damasco para la gran Siria actual. Tema muy puntual, pero es un tema que se enmarca primero en la ofensiva de la Fundación Ramón Areces con las humanidades en sentido de tratar con prioridad temas sobre la relevancia de la historia y de la geopolítica actual. Geopolítica actual que, entre otros, el próximo 5 de mayo será tratada por una importante investigadora de la Brookings Institution, Fiona Hill, que hablará de geopolítica y resiliencia en un mundo incierto. La geopolítica se está adueñando del mundo de la academia, geografía, historia, política e ideología. Nunca se ha hablado tanto de geopolítica como en la actualidad. También traeremos en un próximo futuro, a principios de julio, a Robert Kaplan, destacado comunista, historiador y escritor, que hablará también de estos temas y que acaba de publicar un muy sugestivo libro titulado Wasteland. También escribió en su día La venganza de la geografía, que hace ya varios años ponía sobre el tapete todos estos temas. Quisiera señalar que esta conferencia se enmarca en el programa de colaboración que la Fundación Ramón Areces mantiene con la Universidad de Oxford, en virtud del cual enviamos becarios a dicha universidad y recibimos a los mejores profesores de humanidades de la universidad. Recordemos que tuvimos a personalidades como Timothy Garton Ash hace poco disertando sobre estos temas. En este caso, agradecemos las gestiones realizadas por la Universidad de Oxford, por entendido, para la presencia del profesor Rogan, autor de un libro sobre este mismo tema y quien tiene numerosos libros sobre la caída del Imperio Otomano o la historia de los pueblos árabes. Eugene Rogan es catedrático de Historia Moderna de Oriente Medio en la Universidad de Oxford, en donde enseña desde 1991. Es miembro del St. Anthony's College y director del Centro de Oriente Medio de la universidad. Se licenció en Economía en Columbia y obtuvo un máster y un doctorado en Historia y Estudios de Oriente Medio por la Universidad de Harvard. Es miembro de la Academia Británica y autor de numerosos libros que han sido traducidos a 18 idiomas. Entre ellos cabe destacar Los árabes del Imperio Otomano en la actualidad y la caída de los otomanos, la Gran Guerra en Oriente Próximo. En el verano de 1860, la ciudad de Damasco estalló en una semana de violencia colectiva en la que las turbas masacraron a unos 5.000 cristianos. En esta conferencia se examinarán las medidas adoptadas por las autoridades otomanas para restablecer la ley y el orden, reconstruir los barrios cristianos devastados y reintegrar a los supervivientes en la vida de la ciudad. El éxito de las medidas de reconstrucción otomanas puede juzgarse por la estabilidad del orden político que establecieron en Damasco y que sobreviviría al imperialismo francés y al nacionalismo árabe hasta la autocracia de la familia Asad. El futuro de este legado otomano está ahora en entredicho con la caída de la familia Asad y el ascenso al poder de los salafistas. Por este motivo, las lecciones de los sucesos de Damasco son hoy más pertinentes que nunca, no solo en Siria, también en los vecinos árabes, Líbano, Israel y Palestina. En realidad, el estudio de este hecho histórico concreto nos lleva mucho más allá del mismo y nos hace reflexionar sobre el inmenso impacto que tuvo la caída del Imperio Otomano, que tuvo lugar después de la Primera Guerra Mundial y que desbarató el orden geopolítico existente. El Imperio Otomano, que recordemos abarcaba desde los Balcanes hasta Arabia y al continente africano, supo mantener mediante una hábil mezcla de fuerza y tolerancia la paz y el orden en la región. Su caída provocó unos realineamientos que han seguido fluctuando hasta la época actual. Pensemos en las fuerzas y conflictos emergentes que han surgido en la región, por solo citar algunos. La aparición de potencias regionales como Irán, Israel o Arabia Saudita, la reanudación de los conflictos políticos religiosos entre sunitas y chiitas, la no integración de los kurdos en un Estado moderno, el conflicto Palestina, etcétera, etcétera. Por ello, resulta apasionante poner el contenido de esta conferencia en un contexto geopolítico más amplio que domina con mayor o menor intensidad el escenario del último siglo. Oriente Medio es una fuente inagotable de análisis y reflexión. Como se decía antes, todos estos pueblos tienen tanta geografía como historia. Muchas gracias, Professor Rogan. You're more than welcome at this foundation. Thank you very much for you being with us.
Well, I would like to begin by expressing my great pleasure in the honor of being invited to come to speak in the Fundación Ramón Areces. And I am most grateful to its director, Mr. Raimundo Pérez Hernández, for the generosity of his introduction. I'm also very grateful to Miguel Pérez Méndez for having given me the opportunity to come to speak here, to address an issue which is both historical and timely, as the director has pointed out in his introductory remarks. Indeed, there are elements of relevance of the Damascus events for world affairs, not just in the Middle East. So let us begin with Syria today. On the 27th of November, a group of opposition militias broke out of their enclave in northwestern Syria in the city of Idlib to lay siege to the city of Aleppo. It was the first effort by the opposition to try and force a change in a long-standing repression by the government of Bashar al-Assad. And the siege that they laid on Aleppo was to prove very quickly successful. In 3 days, one of the major strongholds of the Syrian regime collapsed, and Aleppo fell to the opposition. They didn't stop in Aleppo. They immediately moved from Aleppo on to the city of Hama, a city which had a long history of repression, not by Bashar al-Assad so much as by his father, Hafiz al-Assad, who had responded to an uprising in the town in 1982 with legendary violence, almost a will to demonstrate violence against its own people to prevent the Syrians from ever daring to rise again, as they had done in 2011 against Bashar al-Assad. But Hama did not hold out much longer than Aleppo. By the 5th of December, Hama had also fallen to the opposition. These were incredible gains and suggested that the opposition was gaining momentum and the regime was losing confidence. From Hama, the insurgents moved southwards to the city of Homs. Homs, which had seen some of the worst violence of the Syrian civil war after 2011. And within 2 days, Homs had fallen. One had expected the regime to be able to mount meaningful resistance to preserve Homs. It was not to be so. And indeed, by the time Homs had fallen, we now know that already the president, Bashar al-Assad, his family, and many of his closest circle were already in discussion with the Russian government to effect an evacuation of their country. For within a day after the fall of Homs, on the 8th of December, 2024, Damascus fell with no resistance. The regime was simply gone. After nearly 14 years of civil war, it was finally the end of the Assad regime, and the Assad regime after nearly a half century of ruling Syria. And yet, what a victory for the opposition to inherit a Syria destroyed by nearly 14 years of war. And the question posed to the man who was to lead the insurgents to victory, he went by the name of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani until the fall of Damascus, when he shed his military uniform, put on a suit, and emerged under his real name, Ahmed al-Shara, leader of the Salafi jihadist group, Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham. The question was, can Syria be rebuilt? This destroyed country that was left to the opposition. And indeed, was Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, the faction that would be the most likely to see a successful reconstruction of Syria. How would they go about reestablishing the confidence to rebuild Syria and make a Syria that would be safe for the Syrians to return to? Well, there is a historic precedent. In 1860, Damascus witnessed unprecedented violence in which over 5,000 Christians were killed by a mob that came to be known as the Damascus Events. The violence went on for 8 days, in the course of which some 5,000 were killed, 1,000 more wounded, 1,500 houses were destroyed and burned, Christian shops were plundered and looted, women suffered from sexual violence, children were taken into Muslim households. It was an unprecedented act for its time. Indeed, I would go so far as to say it was a genocidal moment. It's one of those moments in history where a target community is seen as an existential threat and in which extermination seems a reasonable solution. We are, of course, no strangers to genocidal moments in the 21st century. In my lifetime alone, the news has been stained with the instances of genocide in Cambodia in the 1970s, in Rwanda and in Bosnia in the 1990s, in Darfur, Myanmar. Today, even Israel stands accused before the International Court of Justice of the grave crime of genocide for its actions in Gaza since the 7th of October. The point of this is to say that genocidal moments are common to all human societies across all continents, in the past as in the present. So the challenge that we as analysts face today is to address the question of how can one bring a deeply divided society, a deeply traumatized society, back from the brink of genocide to rebuild and to lead to a period of cohabitation, such as existed before the genocidal moment. And I believe that the experience of Damascus after 1860 provides valuable guidance towards that question. In a sense, that is the present value of history, when the experience of the past informs our understanding of the present. I know it's why I write history, and I suspect for many of you it's why you like to read history. It's because what we learn from the past can often serve as knowledge of use to addressing the challenges of the present. This is not to say that history repeats. If there's repetition, it's that we in human society tend to repeat historic mistakes, maybe mistakes that could be avoided by a better engagement with history. But rather, my point is, if you want to make sense of the mess we're in today, the challenges we face, the problems that we've created, you need to know some history. And it's that motive which has inspired me to address a lot of the history that I've written in the course of my career. It certainly stands behind my most recent book. I would also want to stress the fact that a week-long massacre in the mid-19th century was violence on an entirely different order from what Syria has suffered in over 13 years of civil war, a very different scale. By best counts, and we don't have accurate counts, some 500,000 Syrians have died in the course of the Syrian civil war. Over 7 million Syrians have been displaced by the war. By the best account of non-governmental organization, no fewer than 3 million houses have been partially or completely destroyed in the course of the war. So this is destruction on an entirely different order of magnitude from what Syria had experienced in the 1860s. But I think it's valuable for Syrians coming out of their civil war to know how, over 150 years ago, the authorities succeeded in rebuilding and reintegrating the traumatized Christian community, and indeed restoring the civility that allowed Christians, Muslims, and Jews to live together at peace and cooperation once again. So I believe there are lessons to be learned from that success. But I think the first question that one asks when addressing the Damascus events is what led the Syrian Muslim community to come to see the Christians in their midst as an existential threat. You're dealing with a society in which 80 to 85% of the population of Damascus was Muslim. There were perhaps 15% Christians, maybe 18%, 2 or 3% Jewish community. So how is it possible that an overwhelming Muslim majority could come to see the Christian minority as a threat to their very existence and well-being? This has to be seen against the long Ottoman centuries. The Ottomans first occupied Damascus in the early 1500s, and there was a period of peaceful cohabitation between all the communities of Damascus, Muslim, Christians, and Jews alike. But it was a society that knew a very rigid social hierarchy, where the 80% Muslim population dominated the 20% of Christians and Jews in a kind of rigid pyramid that was entirely normal in the Sunni Ottoman state, in which the Sultan was also the Caliph, or the religious leader of the Sunni Muslim community globally. So if you think of that hierarchy, there were changes that took place in the first half of the 19th century that was to prove very disruptive to the social structure of Damascus and to the preeminence that Sunni Muslims in the city had taken as their due, as their right. The first element that changed dramatically was in the level of trade. And of course, Damascus was a trade city, but it was a city that traded primarily across the desert. It was, if you like, a port facing the desert where the ships that brought the trade were the ships of the desert, camels. And so the image we have of Damascus, and right up to the first half of the 19th century, is of these long camel caravans coming from Baghdad, coming from Anatolia, coming from the Hijaz, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 camels long. And the thing about camel caravans is that the only trade that is economically viable is high value per weight. You're not going to transport grain long distance by camels. You're going to send silk and precious metals and jewels and high value spices or coffee. So the kind of trade that came across the deserts to Damascus made the markets of Damascus uniquely rich. But in the 19th century, suddenly, trade from the Mediterranean world was beginning to flood the Damascus markets with products coming from industrial Europe. And these were overwhelmingly woven goods, woolens, cottons, that competed with the weaving industry of Damascus itself. And suddenly the dumping of cheap industrial products on the Syrian market was a strain on the merchants and artisans of the city. Their prices began to be under pressure because of the competition from cheaper industrial goods. And to make matters even harder, those ships coming to Beirut to dump industrial good, so as not to return empty to Europe, were buying up all the wool, all the cotton, all the grain, anything they could buy that they could sell in European markets. But this drove up the cost for artisans of their primary products as well. It's a classic crisis in which your prices are being depressed for your finished goods and your primary products are costing you more. And the only people benefiting from these economic changes, these trade changes, were the Christian community, because European trading houses invariably hired Christians to represent them in the markets of Damascus. So as the Muslim artisans and merchants suffered, there was newfound wealth among the Christian community. This was to begin to upset things. Then, where European trade goes, European consuls will follow. And Damascus, until the 1830s, had had no foreign diplomatic missions in the city. The closest that the consuls came was Beirut, which was a port city on the Mediterranean. But starting in the 1830s, beginning with the British and the French, and soon to be followed by the Prussians and the Russians and the Greeks, the Persians, you had a proliferation of consuls, which in itself made Damascus a more interesting town. But each of those consuls was protected by treaty rights that gave them extraterritorial privileges. It exempted them from taxes. It meant that they would never be held accountable by Ottoman law. They would be tried only by the law of their own country. The consuls themselves were few in number, but to staff their consulates, they hired local representatives, and invariably they hired Christians. And the Christians would gain foreign subject status, which meant that they began to benefit from the same extraterritorial trade rights and legal privileges as well. So this meant that if a Muslim had a complaint against a Christian and would try to take him to court to the Islamic courts, they would be denied, and they would have to go to the consular court, where the consuls always found in favor of the Christians against the Muslims. And not only those who worked for the consulates enjoyed these privileges, but they were able to extend the privileges to their family members as well. And so you have hundreds of Christians beginning to benefit from tax privileges and legal privileges that only Europeans enjoyed. And this, again, is contributing to a sense of a growing disproportionate power of the Christian community at the expense of the city's Muslim elites. If the Muslims hoped that their own government might protect their interests, they were to be disappointed, because the Ottoman government by the mid-century was undergoing a series of reforms which were in part designed to try and persuade the European powers of the suitability of the Ottoman Empire in the modern world, to try and prevent European interventions in Ottoman affairs, often justified in terms of protecting Christian and Jewish rights or interests in Ottoman domains. And so in 1856, to demonstrate to the European powers they no longer needed to protect the Christians, the Ottoman government bestowed equal rights before the law on Muslim Christians and Jews, which to us today sounds like an entirely reasonable measure to have taken. But in Islamic laws, the distinctions between Muslims and non-Muslims are reinforced by quotations directly from the Quran, the most important source of Islamic law. And when the Sultan begins to contradict the Quran, he's taken it on himself to contradict God's perfect and immutable word. And this, for the Muslim majority in Damascus, was a totally unacceptable reform. This heightened tensions in ways that were destabilizing enough. If only the Christians of Damascus had showed moderation. But they were acquiring wealth through their trade ties. They were acquiring power through their links to the consuls. And now they were on an equal legal footing even before the Ottoman law. And we have lots of accounts among contemporary Muslim diarists about how Christians, when challenged by a Muslim, would return a blow for a blow or an insult for an insult. It was an inversion of the social hierarchy that had characterized Damascene society since the very beginning of Ottoman rule, and indeed for centuries before. But it raised tensions in society in ways that were absolutely volatile. And the assertiveness of the Christian community contributed to that volatility in meaningful ways. But I still think it wasn't enough that the Christian new wealth and new powers would not in themselves had led to violence, had it not been for the example of civil war in neighboring Lebanon in the summer of 1860. And here, without doing a deep dive into the complex politics of Mount Lebanon, we had a conflict between two very different communities. The Druze, one of the dominant sects of Mount Lebanon, who are themselves a religion that emerged from Shiite Islam in the 12th and 13th century and developed over the course of the centuries into a totally distinctive religion in their own, who had shared power over Mount Lebanon with the Maronite Christians, a group that had split off from the Eastern Orthodox Church to get the recognition of the Pope, to be one of the Uniate Catholic communities of the Orient. So very different communities from Damascus. But in their own ways, the breakdown in relations between the Maronites and Druze, who had formerly ruled Mount Lebanon through a political system in which they collaborated equally, to an assertive Christian community seeking ways to drive the Druze out of the mountains. And for the Druze, the Christians really were an existential threat. And the Druze in this case were the minority. They were able to mobilize perhaps 18,000 fighters as opposed to about 50,000 Christian fighters in Mount Lebanon. And so for the Druze, the tactics of surprise and of absolute violence was the only way they saw that they could preserve their position on the mountain to keep the Christians from driving them out. And in the course of the months of May and June 1860, Lebanon witnessed some of the worst bloodletting in its history, where one by one in towns like Jazin, in Hasbaya and Rashaya, in Zahli and in Deir al-Qamar, the streets literally flowed with blood. And we know that the reaction of the Damascenes was excited to the point of a bloodlust. They saw the Druze had identified their Christian problem, and they'd found a solution: extermination. If you made the Christians disappear, then all those problems associated with the Christian presence would go with them. And the Muslims of Damascus went around hanging lanterns in the markets of the city when they got word of the fall of the Christian town of Zahli overlooking the Bekaa Valley. The authorities had to go and tell them to take the lamps down. But to them, Zahli had kind of represented everything that was arrogant about the assertive Christian presence. And you could sense that the Muslims of Damascus were on the verge of violence themselves. So in this very volatile moment, it only took a spark. And the spark came when a group of Muslim youths drawing crosses on the streets of the Christian quarter forced Christians to defile their symbol by walking over it. Christians complained to the governor. The governor had a bunch of Muslim youths arrested, put in manacles, marched through the streets of the city with brooms to sweep the offending crosses off the streets. And that was all it took to provoke Muslim outrage. A crowd assembled. The crowd very quickly became a riot, and the riot very quickly turned into mass murder. It went on for 8 days, in which the Muslim community tried by all means to exterminate every Christian they could. They then robbed all the Christians' houses, and then they burned them. And the fire burned on for days. There are descriptions of the glow over the city. Indeed, somebody had to keep going back to the quarters to try and rekindle the flames, because it must have run out of wood long after the first of the violence. And indeed, I'm sure the crowd would have been successful had a minority of Muslim notables not intervened to protect Christians. They were led by the Emir Abdul Qadir, himself a former commander of the Algerian resistance of the French occupation of his country, Algeria, in the 1830s. And he was supported by hundreds of Algerian veterans who had come into exile with him to Damascus, who had been armed by the French consul, and they were a militia strong enough to intervene. And other notables of the city of Damascus intervened locally to try and protect their neighbors. And in this way, 85% of the Christians of Damascus were actually saved from massacre, but they fled from their homes literally with the clothes on their back, having lost their homes, all their property, all their tools. In a sense, this genocidal moment would prove a good outcome, the idea that 85% of the target community survives. But it meant that the Ottomans, at the end of the Damascus events, were faced with the challenge of providing everything for 85% of the Christian community who survived with nothing. And to deal with the deeply resentful and antagonistic Muslim majority, who were still on the verge of returning to massacre even after the events were at an order. This is a situation that the Ottoman authorities faced in trying to restore their control, their rule of law, their sovereignty over the rebellious city of Damascus. And I think the measures taken by the Ottomans provide us with a template that allows us to think comparatively about what might be done in other such instances, genocidal moments. The first thing they did, the Sultan appointed his foreign minister, a man named Fuad Pasha, as his minister plenipotentiary to resolve the crisis in both Mount Lebanon and Damascus. This left Fuad Pasha with plenty of rope by which to hang himself. If he got it right, he'd get all the credit, but it was so much more likely he'd get it wrong. But he was a very, very able man. He emerges from this history as really one of the heroes of the story. And he arrives in Damascus about 3 weeks after the events are over, and the first thing he does is he sets about restoring respect for Ottoman law as a foundation for order. This leads to some state violence against its own citizens. He did everything he could to intimidate the notables, to denounce those who were involved in the attacks. They arrested thousands of young men, those suspected of being involved in killing, in robbery, in arson. Those who could be demonstrated to have been involved in the actual killing were executed. And some 50 notables of the city were hanged in public places in the dark of night. So the Damascenes came out to find many of those who had been involved in the violence literally hanging on their doorsteps. The shock of this measure sent just fear through the city of Damascus. There had been hundreds of irregular policemen and soldiers who had lost discipline and also had been involved in the violence. 110 of them were taken to a field on the outskirts of Damascus, and they were shot by a firing squad. And again, the idea that 160 Damascene Muslims would be killed for violence against Christians by an act of state violence was something which set fear through the society of Damascus and made them take Fuad Pasha very seriously. It also, to some extent, told the Christian survivors that the government was going to respond forcefully to protect them from further violence. But you could imagine the tensions that the executions generated. There were some retribution killings by the Muslim community against Christians. The city remained very much on a razor's edge. So you couldn't try and restore order just by the exercise of state violence. Next, you had to persuade the Christians to move back into the city of Damascus. Now, they had no houses to go back to. They'd all been burned down. And many of them had fled under government control to Beirut, which had already been flooded by Christian survivors of their own civil war. So the Ottomans wanted to normalize Damascus, demonstrate to the international community that they were in control here. And so they forced many Muslims to empty their households to provide space for the Christians to move into. This is again another measure to reassure the Christians and bring them back to the center of Damascus. But again, more tensions with those Muslims who were forced to vacate their own houses. But it was progress. The next thing was you had to find a means to indemnify the Christians for their losses so that they could rebuild their homes and go back to work. Because without the Christian community, the economy of Damascus had really ground to a halt. So there's a practical side to this as well. And the next thing the Ottomans do is they put in place a series of tribunals to hear the claims the Christians made for what they'd lost in the events, in terms of the value of their houses, the value of their possessions, the value of their merchandise in their shops, or the tools of their trade. The government created a commission which they staffed uniquely by Muslims and Jews to review these claims. This was good because it meant that the Muslims and Jews of Damascus were in some way responsible for the size of the indemnities awarded, because the next step the government would do was tax the Muslims and Jews to create a sum of money to pay the indemnities, so that there would actually be payments made to the Christians of Damascus so they could begin to rebuild their houses and go back to work. Now, it goes without saying that the tax did not come anywhere near generating the money it took to pay all of the claims of the Christians. And of course, the Muslims and to some extent the Jewish community felt very resentful of having to pay a tax to allow the Christians to rebuild. But crucially, though the funds were insufficient to completely compensate the Christians for their losses, it was enough. It was enough to allow them to rebuild their houses. It was enough to allow them to go back to work and to buy the tools of their trade, which is also a lesson in its own right, to not make, as it were, perfect justice your goal. And the Ottomans seem to have taken that wisdom on board every step along the way. They were under a lot of pressure from the European powers to try and arrest everyone responsible for the violence. Mobs that numbered thousands. The Ottomans stopped. When they had demonstrated that they were willing to use capital punishment, they stopped there. And they taxed the Muslims only so far. They distributed as much money as they were able to raise, but they didn't take it far enough that it preserved the tensions. And in this way, the Christians were able to rebuild their houses in their quarters, so that by the end of 1864, not quite 4 years after the events, we have reports that basically the reconstruction of Christian homes and shops was complete. But the tensions persist between Muslims and Christians. This idea of reintegrating the Christian community and bridging the divide between these deeply divided communities had still not been achieved. Indeed, my sources suggest that as late as 1869, events elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire, like the revolt in Crete, risked provoking a new round of massacre of the Muslims against the Christians. The Christians continued to be fearful that they were living under the threat of violence from their fellow Damascenes. So something more had to be done besides justice, restore of order and law, and reconstruction to bridge the divide. And this is where the long-term project comes into it, because what the Ottomans did next was transformative. Fuad Pasha was called back to Istanbul and was raised to become the Grand Vizier or Prime Minister. And in that position, he never forgot Damascus. And he approved a new law to reorganize provincial governance, which allowed for 3 provinces to be merged into a super province with Damascus as its capital, merging Beirut, Damascus, and Jerusalem. This gave the treasury of Damascus perhaps 5 times its income of what it had when it was just the city of Damascus alone. And this allowed the governors of Damascus to go on a spending spree. And that spending spree was an investment in the social and economic and political capital of the city in a way that benefited all communities at no one's expense. So they invested in roads and in communications like the telegraph, which just allowed merchants to communicate across towns and cities, both the rapid exchange of information and the safe movement of goods and services by secure roads. They invested tremendous amount of money in building new and enlarged and modern markets. This is when the markets, if you've been to Damascus and you've been to Souk Hamidiyya or Souk Midhat Pasha on the street called Straight, they were built at this time. And these were modeled on the European arcades of places like Milano and London. The Damascenes, ever proud, insisted their arcades were infinitely more beautiful than Milano's. And but these markets provided commercial space to Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike. That meant that shopkeepers were once again side by side to each other, exchanging with each other, talking with each other in a daily way. The government presence in Damascus expanded dramatically, which doesn't sound good to those who were perhaps suspicious of government, but it was attractive to the Syrians on several grounds. One, it meant that the government built a lot of government buildings, which was a major injection into the building trade. So lots of public buildings being built at this time. Each one of those buildings was full of offices that needed to be filled by people with government jobs. And Damascenes were very keen on government jobs because they provided a stable income, a good pension, a lot of respect. And so the spread of the opportunity for government jobs was something that Damascenes welcomed. And also through the new instruments of municipal governance by that provincial reform law of 1864, you have all of these elected bodies with representation by all the communities of Damascus, Muslim, Christians, and Jews alike. So they were meeting in public bodies where they were equally elected to oversee the running of their city. Lastly, the government invested in schools. Until this point, perhaps the best schools in Damascus had been opened by Christian missionaries, and many Muslims hesitated to send their children to study under the Christians. The Ottomans began to really invest in state schools, open to all, including schools like the Maktab Anbar, which was the only high school open to Damascus. And the graduates of the school were guaranteed great government jobs. They'd been given exactly the education to be able to do government work to the high standard expected. So in all of these ways, the 1870s and 1880s witnessed a transformation of the investment in the city of Damascus that, as I said before, brought benefit to all communities equally. It wasn't as though these were changes that benefited minorities over the majority or vice versa. And moreover, they contributed to the public spaces in which Muslim, Christian, and Jew would meet and interact under normal, natural circumstances, like cafes. The theater begins to really emerge in Damascus in the 1880s and 90s. And you can imagine, we have accounts of huge crowds flocking to the theater. This is going to have involved all Damascenes in a kind of common sociability that was enormously restorative of bridging the divide between Muslims and Christians. It is not a quick fix. The experience of rebuilding after the Damascus Events suggests this is a project that can take 20 years to heal the scars of an act of communal violence and to create a common society. But if it could be done under the Ottoman Empire of the 1860s, 70s, 80s, then there's no reason to believe that it is not something that we can repeat in the 21st century. And I would argue this is the legacy that the new governors of Syria, under Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, under Ahmed al-Shara, will seek to preserve today as they go about the very demanding challenges of rebuilding a post-Assad Syria. In other words, we have in history an example of how Syrians could solve Syrian problems. This is not to be overly optimistic. Syria at present faces very grave challenges. The tensions between the Sunni majority in Syria and some of the minority communities, the Alawis in particular because of their association with the Asad family and the previous regime, but also some of the Christian churches which had been steadfast in supporting the regime, largely out of fear of organizations like Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham and other salafi jihadi organizations. And indeed, the recent massacres of Alawi communities in places like Banyas and Tartus and Latakia, witnessed just last month, demonstrates the clear and present danger that communal tensions and divisions continue to pose to Syria. But the new governors of Syria are pragmatic. They have shown an awareness that in order to get outside sanctions on Syria lifted, to encourage outside funding into the country to help with rebuilding, to encourage Syrians who have fled the country to return to help with the reconstruction of the society and the economy of Syria, they're going to have to take such measures as the Ottomans undertook over 150 years ago with such success. And of course, it isn't just Syria that needs to contemplate the challenges of rebuilding from deeply divisive traumas. If we look at what has been going on in Lebanon, the years since its own civil war, or indeed looking at the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians being fought in Gaza since the 7th of October, but leading to mounting violence in the West Bank today, and many arguing that the prospects of cohabitation between Israelis and Palestinians has been reduced to vanishing point. Indeed, even in those extreme cases, one can see where through the restoration of law and order and through the investments in society and economy in ways that bring benefit to all sides, one can imagine a peaceful society that would be a norm not just in Syria, but across the Middle East after far too many years of civil conflict. It's perhaps a lot to hope for, but not too much to ask. For the peace of this region is really the peace of the world. So with that, I thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I look forward to another opportunity to speak soon.
May I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations for a wonderful and super interesting lecture, which we all appreciate a lot. There's an interrogation point of all what you said. What was the role of the Jewish community? Because one doesn't really clearly see on which side were the Jewish community, whether on the side of the Muslims or on the side of the Christians. What role historically did they play on that?
It's an excellent question, Mr. Ambassador. And I would say that the Jewish community in 1860 had tried to keep as low a profile as possible so that they would not be caught up in the violence which, as the mobs made clear, focused uniquely on the Christian community. And this reflected the recent history of the Damascus Jewish community, which in 1840 had suffered an unprecedented attack of its own when an Eastern European concept, the blood libel, was brought to Damascus. A Franciscan priest disappeared in the Jewish quarter, was presumed killed, and when his remains were found, and those of his servant, it was said that he had been killed so that his blood might be used to make Passover matzos. This is absolutely from outside the Ottoman world entirely. It's the only instance I know of a blood libel in Ottoman domains. But it led the ruling authorities. Damascus at the time was under Egyptian rule. And the Egyptians responded with great violence by rounding up the leaders of the Jewish community, torturing several to death. The numbers killed were, I believe, under 10. But it demonstrated the community's vulnerability. And it was only when European Jewish leaders such as Moses Montefiore used their best offices to petition the government of Muhammad Ali in Egypt to release those Jews still in captivity and to stop their persecution. But it was something which I think had made the Jewish community just aware of their vulnerability to mob violence. And I think in that sense, for the Jewish community, the events of 1860 reawakened those fears and encouraged them to keep a very low profile. But, there was clearly no sense of common cause between the Christians and Jews. And I would say many of the Christians at Damascus spoke in very anti-Semitic terms of the Jewish community. So lest we cast the non-Muslims of making a common front, they really looked after their own communal interests. And there were many accusations by the Christians that what the Jewish community had done in 1860 was almost to aid and abet the rioters that led the massacre. I think this was, historically an unjust accusation to have leveled, but it tells you something about the ways in which the community saw each other.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.